A silent night in Green Bay. The tension in Clara's chest grew tighter with each passing second, the air thick with fear as she dialed 911. She heard the familiar, automated voice on the other end of the line, but it was almost surreal. 911. What's your emergency? Came the voice. Clara's hands shook uncontrollably as she struggled to speak. I don't know what's happening. She managed to gasp, her voice trembling. My son's head. I found it. It's in a bucket in the basement. You need to come. Ma'am, calm down. Can you tell me what happened? The dispatcher urged, trying to keep her grounded. Clara glanced back at George, who was still staring at the bucket in disbelief. His face was pale, the blood draining from it as he processed the horror before him. She heard him mutter, "This can't be real." But it was. It was all too real. I don't know. I thought he was just upset, you know. He was in his room with Emma, and then she left, and I thought everything would be fine. But this. Clara's voice faltered as she looked at the mutilated remains of her son. Please, you have to hurry. The dispatcher reassured her that help was on the way and instructed her to stay put, but Clara's instincts told her to run, to get away from that house, away from the scene of what was undoubtedly the worst thing she had ever witnessed. She stood frozen, unsure of what to do. It was as though time had stopped, and yet the sirens in the distance were getting closer. Her mind raced back to the days before, when Jace had seemed fine, just struggling with his breakup, but nothing that would explain this monstrous act. He had been a quiet, artistic soul. Sure, he'd been through some rough patches, but he wasn't violent. He wasn't a person who would have ever gotten into something like this, or so she thought. The door to the basement creaked open behind her, and Clara turned to see George standing there, his face contorted with disbelief. He walked toward the bucket with slow, deliberate steps, as though hoping to wake up from some horrific nightmare. When he reached the foot of the stairs, he too hesitated before bending down to lift the towel. The sight of Jace's disembodied head left George gasping. Jesus Christ, he murmured, stepping back. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. She pressed a hand to her mouth, as though trying to hold back a scream. We need to get out of here, she whispered urgently. We need to get out before they. But George cut her off, pulling her closer as the sirens grew louder. It's too late, he said grimly. They're coming. You have to tell them what happened. His voice was flat, his eyes hollow with fear and confusion. Clara nodded numbly, still clutching her phone to her ear. They're coming, she repeated, though she wasn't sure if she meant the police or something darker, something more terrifying than anything she could explain. Moments later, 2 police cruisers skidded to a stop outside the house. The officers rushed to the door, their boots thumping heavily on the porch. Clara and George stepped back, allowing them entry. The officers wasted no time, immediately heading down to the basement after Clara's frantic explanation. The air in the basement seemed colder now, heavier with dread. When the officers lifted the towel, their faces went pale. One of them muttered under his breath, "This isn't something we see every day." They radioed for backup. The officers at the scene knew, deep in their gut, that something far worse had taken place in this house than a simple murder. This was no ordinary crime. It was clear that whoever had committed it was not acting with any kind of normal mindset. More units, more units, one officer called into the radio, his voice shaking slightly. We need forensics. And we need them now. As the police inspected the basement, Clara stayed frozen in the living room with George. Neither of them could fully grasp what was unfolding in their own home. They stared at the floor, not looking at each other, not speaking. Neither knew what to say. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, a place where something far beyond comprehension had happened. But as the police combed through the scene, Clara felt the tension building in her stomach. They were going to want answers, and she didn't have any. Her mind raced for any clue, any hint of what might have led to this horrific moment. but she came up empty. What had happened between her son, Jace, and Emma? How had things escalated so quickly? Jace had always been a gentle soul, a person who found peace in the quiet of nature, in carving wooden sculptures with his father. But now, as Clara stood in the living room, watching the officers filter in and out of the basement, she realized that nothing about her son's death made sense, and she feared that perhaps somewhere, her son's life had been taken by someone who was once a friend, or worse, someone who had been closer than that. The web of lies. The following hours felt like days. Clara and George were separated by police officers, each being questioned in turn. The house was swarming with detectives, forensic teams, and uniformed officers, all trying to piece together the puzzle that seemed more like a nightmare than a reality. Clara sat in the living room, feeling like a stranger in her own home, watching as her son's death became a matter for the cold, methodical investigation of the police. The questions came in waves, each one more pointed than the last. Clara had never felt more detached from the situation, but she knew she had to answer, even if she didn't know where to begin. "Mrs. Monroe, we need to ask you about your son's relationship with his girlfriend, Emma. Can you tell us about that?" one of the detectives asked, his voice steady, but with a hint of weariness. Clara rubbed her forehead, feeling a headache coming on. Emma was a part of Jace's life for a while. They'd been having issues recently. I didn't know much about it. She was here earlier this evening, but she left before I found. Clara's voice trailed off as she thought about the gruesome discovery. Before I found what was in the basement. The detective nodded, taking notes. "Do you know if they had any fights recently? Any reason that you can think of that might have led to this?" Clara hesitated, her thoughts racing. They argued from time to time, like any couple. But Jace, he wouldn't hurt anyone. Not like this. The detective didn't press her further, sensing that Clara was too distraught to offer much insight. But the lack of information was eating away at him. They needed answers, and Clara's grief wasn't enough to provide them. Meanwhile, in the basement, the scene was being thoroughly examined. The bucket, the severed head, and the blood-soaked room all seemed too calculated, too deliberate. It didn't feel like a random act of violence. It felt personal, intimate even. There was something methodical about how the crime had been committed, something unsettling in its cruelty. "Detective, you need to see this," an officer called out as he discovered a bloody set of chains lying on the floor next to the bed where Jace had been attacked. The chains were not only stained with blood, but they also appeared to be custom-made, possibly to be worn during some sort of bondage play. The sight of them was a chilling indication of the direction this case was taking. It wasn't just a murder. It was a planned, sadistic act. The officers made their way upstairs to Clara and George, who were still sitting in the living room, awaiting further questioning. The silence between them was deafening, as if neither could comprehend what had transpired in the last few hours. Clara's mind wandered back to the moment she first saw the bucket. Her heart had dropped when she realized what was inside, but it didn't end there. The horror of seeing her son's head severed was just the beginning. Now she had to face the reality that the young woman who had been a part of her son's life, Emma, might not just be a victim in this story. She could be involved in it. As if on cue, a squad car pulled up outside the house. The officers had found Emma, and she was being brought in for questioning. Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. What would they discover? Was Emma involved in her son's brutal death? The thought made her feel nauseous. Inside the interrogation room, Emma sat with her hands folded in her lap. She seemed calm, almost eerily so, as she answered the detective's questions. Her pale skin, tousled hair, and the dark circles under her eyes suggested that she hadn't been sleeping well. But it wasn't just her appearance that unsettled the detectives. It was the way she answered questions, her lack of emotion when speaking about Jace's death. "Tell us about the events leading up to tonight," the detective said, leaning forward in his chair. "What happened when you were with Jace?" Emma stared blankly at the table for a moment before answering. We were fighting earlier. He and I had some issues. He was upset, I guess. But he was still my boyfriend, and I didn't want anything to happen to him. I just wanted to leave and cool off. Did he seem upset when you left? Did he threaten you or anyone else? The detective pressed. No, Emma said, shaking her head. He was just upset. He didn't want me to leave, but I had to get away. I'm not the type to stick around when things get out of hand. The detective narrowed his eyes. But when you left, you didn't just leave the house. You left your boyfriend's body parts behind, didn't you, Emma? Her face went white, and she began to tremble slightly. I don't know what you mean, she said softly. The detective leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. You were seen leaving the house earlier with blood on your hands, Emma. There's blood in your car. We know you were at the scene. Emma's hands clenched into fists, her fingernails digging into her palms. I didn't do it, she snapped, her voice suddenly loud. I didn't kill him. I didn't touch him when I left. I swear. Her reaction was enough to raise suspicion, and the detectives knew they needed to dig deeper. They began asking about her history with Jace, about their fights and the drugs they had been using. Emma was silent for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I don't know what happened, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I didn't kill him. The detectives continued their questioning, but Emma's story remained inconsistent. She seemed unsure about the details, as though she couldn't quite remember what had happened in the hours leading up to Jace's death. Meanwhile, Clara sat back in the living room, feeling numb. She wanted answers, but the more she learned, the less she understood. What kind of person could do something like this to her son? How had things spiraled so far out of control? As the night stretched on, Clara's heart felt heavy with grief and confusion. She knew that Jace was no angel, but he didn't deserve to die like this. He didn't deserve to be reduced to a grisly image in a basement. And now, with Emma's involvement looming large, Clara could only wonder how deep the web of lies went. A dark history unveiled. The following morning felt no less surreal. Clara had barely slept, the images of the crime scene replaying in her mind over and over. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was awake with a constant, gnawing question. How had this happened? How had her son, her sweet, artistic boy, come to be in the basement, decapitated, dismembered, and discarded like trash? The police had continued their investigation into Emma's involvement, but as the day wore on, a clearer picture began to emerge. A pattern of violence, drug use, and erratic behavior that had slowly consumed not only Jace's life, but also the life of the woman he had been involved with. Emma, it seemed, had more than a passing history with destructive behavior. In fact, her background revealed a chilling path that led directly to the night of the murder. Detectives had learned that Emma's past was as tangled and dangerous as the events surrounding Jace's death. She had grown up in a broken home, with a father who had been in and out of prison, and a mother who struggled with addiction. From an early age, Emma had been exposed to the harsh realities of life. By the time she was 16, she was already experimenting with drugs and was involved in a series of unhealthy relationships. But it wasn't just drugs that had shaped her. Emma had also developed a fascination with violence, particularly with the kind of disturbing behavior that bordered on sadism. She had been known to get into fights, often to the point of injury. In her teenage years, she'd been arrested twice for assault, once after a violent altercation with a boyfriend. Those incidents were a window into the psyche of the young woman who had become so entwined in Jace's life. Emma's relationship with Jace, however, had been one of obsession. She had manipulated him, using his vulnerability as a tool to control him. At first, the two had been inseparable, young, wild, and free. But as time passed, their relationship became more toxic, especially with the introduction of harder drugs. Jace's family had tried to intervene on several occasions, but he had always defended Emma, even when her behavior grew more erratic. Detectives had also uncovered that the night of the murder was not the first time Emma had become violent. She had a history of blacking out during drug-fueled outbursts, a symptom of the unchecked rage that had simmered beneath her calm, almost lifeless exterior. The drugs, the history of violence, and the chain of manipulations all created the perfect storm for what happened that night. But the real breakthrough came when the police uncovered Emma's internet history. Just days before the murder, Emma had searched the name of a notorious serial killer. She had been obsessed with the details of his crimes, reading articles, watching documentaries, and even visiting sites dedicated to his infamy. The killer she was fascinated with was none other than Jeffrey Dahmer, a name that, for many in Wisconsin, stirred memories of terror and disgust. The fact that Emma had been so obsessed with his crimes was a red flag. Dahmer's actions had been brutal, calculating, and horrifyingly methodical, and it seemed that Emma had been trying to learn from him. As the police pieced together Emma's history and her fixation on Dahmer's sadistic acts, they began to connect the dots. Jace's death had not been a crime of passion. It had been planned, cold, deliberate, and disturbingly calculated. It was clear that Emma was not just a victim of circumstance. She had been complicit in this crime. But the question remained, was she fully responsible, or had something inside her snapped that night, pushing her to commit the unthinkable? Clara, meanwhile, was struggling with the shock of it all. The woman her son had loved, or perhaps had been obsessed with, was not the sweet, innocent girl she had once thought she was. Clara couldn't shake the images of Emma's calm face, the same face that had once smiled at her in the living room, only hours before Jace had been slaughtered. Emma had been playing a part, and Clara had failed to see the darkness behind it. The police had confirmed that Emma had been the one to initiate the deadly chain of events. It was clear now that the two had been doing drugs in Jace's basement, as they often did when they were together. But on that night, things had taken a darker turn. According to the forensic evidence, Emma had brought a set of chains with her that night. At first, it appeared to be something they had used for their usual sexual play, but it quickly escalated. Emma had claimed, during her interrogation, that Jace had asked her to choke him. At first, it seemed like a consensual act, but Emma's reaction, her enjoyment of the power she had over him, soon revealed the truth. When she had wrapped the chain around Jace's neck, it wasn't just a part of their usual encounter. Emma had slowly tightened it, enjoying the control she had over him. At first, Jace had struggled, but his resistance only seemed to excite her more. She later admitted to the police that she had felt a rush, a thrill, from the power she held over him. But as he began to lose consciousness, Emma didn't stop. She kept tightening the chain, savoring the feeling of having life slip away from him. When she realized he had died, she was almost disappointed. There was no more struggle, no more fight to feel. But Emma's sadistic tendencies didn't end with the strangulation. Emma had proceeded to dismember Jace's body in a sickeningly deliberate manner. She started with his head, as if it was the ultimate trophy, an act that mirrored the crimes she had so admired in her twisted obsession with Dahmer. As she severed his body into pieces, she didn't seem disturbed by the violence. Instead, she appeared almost detached, as if she were performing a task that needed to be done. After she had dismembered him, Emma took the head and placed it into a bucket at the bottom of the basement stairs, covering it with a towel, perhaps out of some twisted sense of respect for the gruesome act she had committed. But the more the police uncovered, the more it became clear that Emma hadn't just acted out of rage. She had planned this with chilling precision. The drugs had fueled her actions, but the darkness inside her had always been there, waiting for the right moment to surface. Clara, in the quiet of the living room, began to feel the full weight of the horror. Her son was gone, his life snuffed out in the most brutal way imaginable. And the person responsible was someone she had once trusted. As she sat there, lost in the depths of her grief, she realized that the life she had built, the quiet, stable home, was now shattered. She had thought she knew everything about her son, but now, with the truth unraveling, she could see that there had always been pieces of Jace's life that she didn't understand. And as the investigation moved forward, Clara knew that there would be no easy answers. Emma was a monster hidden in plain sight, and though the police had uncovered much, the real truth about what happened in that basement might never be fully understood. The descent into madness. As the days passed, the investigation into Jess Monroe's brutal murder became even more complex. With Emma now the primary suspect, the detectives were determined to piece together the final details of that fateful night. But with every new discovery, it became increasingly difficult to understand just how deep Emma's capacity for violence truly ran. The night of the murder, according to Emma's account, had begun like any other drug-fueled evening. She and Jace had been using methamphetamine, something they had both grown accustomed to over the past year. As the drug began to take hold, the pair became more erratic. Emma's recollection of events was fragmented, but the evidence was clear. What had started as a toxic relationship had escalated into a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. Emma's coldness in the hours following Jace's death was as chilling as the crime itself. When police arrived at the scene, she had already fled the house. But they weren't far behind. Emma's red van, the one she had used to transport the dismembered parts of Jace's body, was parked outside her apartment complex. Bloody footprints leading from the van confirmed the officers' worst fears. Emma had not only been involved in Jace's death, but she had also taken pleasure in what she had done. The forensic investigation at the scene was damning. Shad's dismembered body, spread across different bags and containers, spoke of a deliberate, methodical act. The police had found parts of his torso inside a storage tote, and his heart was discarded in one location while his lungs were found elsewhere. The horror didn't end there. Each body part had been meticulously cleaned, as if Emma had intended to remove all traces of the crime. But the bloody chains and the blood-soaked room in Jace's bedroom told a different story, one of a brutal, savage attack. As detectives traced Emma's movements, they found that she had visited multiple stores in the days before the murder, buying a variety of tools. Among the purchases were a set of sharp knives, large enough to sever limbs, and rubber gloves, likely used to avoid leaving fingerprints. It was clear that Emma had planned this act of violence, perhaps even before that night. But why? Detectives learned that in the days leading up to the murder, Emma's behavior had become increasingly erratic. She had been growing more withdrawn, obsessively rereading the stories of Jeffrey Dahmer's gruesome crimes. Her fascination with him wasn't just academic, it was personal. She had even started mimicking his behavior in small ways, purchasing the same kinds of chains and tools Dahmer had used to restrain and control his victims. Her fixation with Dahmer, along with her escalating drug use, had created the perfect storm. She had already been teetering on the edge, and it only took a small push for her to completely snap. That push came in the form of Jace's increasingly possessive behavior. Despite their rocky relationship, Jace had developed deeper feelings for Emma, desiring a more committed bond. Emma, however, was only interested in using him. She had no intention of being faithful, and as Jace grew more desperate, she began to lose her control over him. He was no longer just a pawn. He was a problem that needed to be dealt with. On the night of the murder, Emma had found herself at a breaking point. In her mind, Jace's obsession with her had become a source of annoyance, and in her drug-addled state, she sought to regain the power she had over him. When she walked into the basement that night, chains in hand, it wasn't just to engage in their usual sexual games. It was to assert her dominance, and when she wrapped the chain around his neck, something inside her snapped. The struggle that followed only made it more thrilling, more exciting. She had never felt more alive. As Jace's life drained from him, Emma experienced what she described as an intense high, one that was greater than anything the drugs could provide. His body went limp, and for a moment, Emma had felt a sense of regret. But it was short-lived. She quickly went to work, dismembering him, compartmentalizing his body with a precision that was almost surgical. She spoke of the act as if it was just a task, cutting off his head, severing his limbs, carefully placing them in bags. There was no remorse, no hesitation, just a twisted sense of satisfaction. The horror didn't end with the murder. Emma's next steps were equally disturbing. She had meticulously packed the parts of Jace's body into her van, hiding them in boxes to avoid suspicion. She intended to take them with her, as if she were moving a piece of furniture, but something made her hesitate. Perhaps it was the weight of what she had just done. In her drugged stupor, she couldn't bring herself to take everything with her. Only the head and one leg made it into the van. But when the police found her van and examined the contents, they found the dismembered leg tucked inside a crock-pot box. They also found evidence of Jace's blood splattered across the seats, mixed with traces of Emma's own blood from where she had been cut by the knives during the dismemberment. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that was damning. It was Emma's demeanor when confronted by the officers. Clara had not seen Emma since the night of the discovery, but news had spread quickly. Emma was a local figure, known by many in the area for her chaotic lifestyle. Clara had heard rumors of her erratic behavior, but she had never imagined the extent of it. Now, the woman who had once been part of her son's life, someone who had been welcomed into their home, was revealed to be the one responsible for his brutal death. The police had found the evidence they needed, but they still had one critical question. Was Emma fully aware of the enormity of what she had done, or had she simply been consumed by the drugs and her obsession with violence? Her interrogation had lasted hours, but Emma remained eerily calm throughout. She described the murder with unsettling detail, but it was her lack of remorse that truly sent chills down the investigators' spines. Her responses were almost clinical, as if she were talking about an assignment she had completed. There was no emotion behind her words. "I didn't want to kill them," Emma said at one point, her voice strangely detached. "But once it started, it felt good. I just kept going." It was this admission that led the investigators to make a final conclusion. Emma wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was a predator, someone who had manipulated, tortured, and killed without any real remorse. She had carefully crafted a plan to destroy Jace, and she had carried it out with chilling precision. The trial of a monster. As the weeks passed, the reality of Jace Monroe's brutal murder began to settle in. The small town of Green Bay, Wisconsin, was no stranger to crime, but nothing like this. The murder, the dismemberment, and the chilling calmness with which Emma described her actions left the community stunned and horrified. No one who had known Jace could fathom that the young woman he had once loved, once trusted, could commit such a heinous crime. And yet, all the evidence pointed to her. As the trial date loomed, Clara found herself torn between grief and anger. She spent countless hours replaying the events in her mind, trying to understand how Emma had come into their home, into their lives, and ultimately become the person who would murder her son. She couldn't reconcile the person Emma had once been. The girl who had smiled at her, sat at her dinner table, and shared their family moments, with the cold, calculating murderer who now stood before the law. The courtroom was packed with journalists, local residents, and families eager to see justice served. Emma, who had once appeared as the sweet, troubled girlfriend, now sat in the defendant's chair, her expression a mix of indifference and quiet contempt. Her once tousled hair was neatly combed, and she wore a plain, gray jumpsuit. She looked almost serene, but her eyes betrayed the underlying rage that simmered beneath the surface. Her defense team had tried to portray Emma as a victim of her circumstances, claiming that her violent behavior was a result of her traumatic childhood and mental health issues. The defense sought to argue that Emma had not been in control of her actions at the time of the murder, citing her drug abuse, her history of mental illness, and her obsession with serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer. They suggested that she had suffered a psychotic break, and therefore she should not be held fully responsible for her actions. But the prosecution had a much different narrative. They painted a picture of a cold, calculating killer, a woman who had planned and executed the murder with chilling precision. They presented the evidence: the chains, the knives, the dismembered body, the meticulously cleaned crime scene, and Emma's own confession. They played the recordings of her interrogation, where she recounted the murder without a hint of remorse, describing the act with a detached calmness that made even the seasoned officers shudder. Once it started, Emma had said during her confession, "I just kept going. It felt good. I didn't want to stop." The prosecution highlighted Emma's obsession with violent criminals like Dahmer, noting her extensive online searches for information about his crimes just days before the murder. They argued that Emma wasn't a victim. She was a predator. The jury was presented with the disturbing facts that she had not just killed Jace, but had taken pleasure in dismembering his body. She had severed his head, removed his limbs, and discarded them in bags, carefully hiding the pieces like trophies. It was this cold, methodical nature of the crime that struck a chord with the jury. Emma's actions were not those of someone who had snapped under pressure or who had lost control. They were the actions of someone who had planned the murder, someone who had carefully executed every step, showing no regard for the life she had taken. As the trial continued, Emma's demeanor remained unchanged. She smirked during testimony, showing no remorse, no regret. Her eyes would occasionally flicker to the jury, and her lips would curl into a subtle grin. Her behavior only deepened the jury's conviction that she was not insane. She was calculating and manipulative. On the witness stand, Clara Monroe was called to testify. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. She had to recount the moment when she found her son's severed head in the basement, the horror that had paralyzed her, the screams that had echoed through the house. She spoke of Jace's life, his love for carving wood, his kindness, and his troubled relationship with Emma. But as she told the court about the son she had lost, her words were laced with sorrow and rage. "I never thought she could do this," Clara said, her voice breaking. "She was part of our family. She was someone I let into my home. And now, she's the one who killed my son. She didn't just kill him. She butchered him. I want justice for Jace. I want her to pay for what she did." Clara's words were a sharp, painful reminder to the jury of the life that had been lost. Jace's life, full of potential and promise, was stolen in a moment of cruelty and violence. The jury, moved by Clara's testimony and the overwhelming evidence, began to deliberate. The verdict. After several hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, and Clara could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had waited for this moment, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure she was ready to hear the words that would define Emma's fate. The judge called the court to order, and the room fell silent. Emma's defense attorney looked at her, his face a mask of uncertainty. Emma, however, remained composed, her expression unreadable. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Emma Parker, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, and third-degree sexual assault." Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her. The words echoed in her ears, and for a moment, she didn't believe them. Emma, the woman who had shattered her world, was finally going to face the consequences of her actions. The monster who had murdered her son was going to be held accountable. But the relief was short-lived. Emma's defense team immediately filed an appeal, arguing that the jury had been swayed by the graphic details of the crime and had not fully considered Emma's mental state at the time of the murder. They sought to have her sentenced to a mental institution instead of prison, claiming that she was not in control of her actions due to her psychosis. The sentencing. Several months later, Emma was sentenced. The courtroom was again filled with family, friends, and media, all waiting to hear the final word on Emma's fate. Clara sat in the front row, her face pale but determined. She had waited so long for this moment, and now that it had arrived, she felt a bitter sense of finality. The judge addressed the court, summarizing the brutality of the crime and the lack of remorse shown by the defendant. He spoke of the horror that Emma had inflicted on Jace and the devastating impact it had on his family. "Emma Parker," the judge said, his voice stern, "you took the life of a young man in the most violent and gruesome way imaginable. Your actions were not those of a person who lost control. They were the actions of a cold, calculating individual who took pleasure in inflicting pain. You will spend the rest of your life behind bars. The sentence was clear: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Emma's expression remained unchanged as the judge's words were read aloud. She didn't flinch, didn't react. But Clara could see it. She could see the truth of who Emma really was: a monster.